think I might be ready to go now. Sorry about that. Thanks for your patience. Thanks for coming out, everybody, to learn how to learn AWS. I feel like a lot of the people in the room are much more experienced than I am, but hopefully, I can give you one good tidbit here. So today, I'm just going to talk about my background real quick, why learning AWS is important, why it's hard, how to get your bearings, making and executing a learning plan, and then some learning resources and guides for you, and then kind of wrapping it up. So my background, I'm a software engineer by trade, probably like 12 years of experience, mostly on the web side. I've done a lot of Ruby on Rails, other kind of things. Currently working with some software companies in town and remotely to help improve their teams through their hiring process. So kind of creating custom work samples and other kind of challenges for engineers who are applying to go through and kind of get a sense of what are their skills and, if we can help them get better and kind of learn before they get to the job even. Through doing a lot of Rails stuff, I've used Heroku a lot. It's kind of just an easy way to get your code up and running somewhere. So you can just say, git push my code up there, and it just generally works. So that'll actually get you really far. And I feel like for a long time that kind of prevented me from needing to learn AWS. And then I got in an environment where okay, we're doing some HIPAA compliance stuff, using AWS. I need to really get a good sense of this. And so I kind of had to go through the process of all right, how do I actually get a sense of, how do I learn this? I think sometimes you need that kind of moment of all right, I should really learn this thing. So I've had it on my to-do list for a long time, and here are kind of some steps that I've taken to kind of learn it. Still definitely a beginner, but if I can save somebody an hour or 2 hours of getting set up and kind of learning oriented, then I think that would be great. I'll explain why learning AWS is important. It feels good. Learning new things is fun. You get a sense of accomplishment. If you've been doing this for a long time, maybe you get a sense of what does that beginner's mind feel like again. You're kind of fumbling around these commands. You don't actually know what's going on. So it's a good experience. I think you get a better understanding of what's actually happening in your application, in your architecture. So I think that's a really good, positive thing. I think if you have a technical discussion on your team, you're able to better contribute to that and kind of make some good impact. I think you're more versatile, so you can play different roles. You're not just kind of pigeonholed into, okay, I'm a sysadmin or I'm a developer. You can kind of play multiple different roles potentially. And then you can lead efforts to improve your system, which I think is a positive fact. One thing that I like about AWS is a powerful tool. So there are whole classes of problems that you can maybe solve with AWS or other kind of cloud platforms. Maybe you have a database server and you have to keep thinking about, do I have enough space? Well, maybe there's a whole AWS solution that'll just kind of not have you think about that ever again, or at least in theory. If you're going to do some cool DevOps stuff, maybe you can redeploy your whole architecture with one command. You can't do that maybe with some other, kind of platforms. Or doing auto scaling, and if one of your on it seamlessly fixes itself. So there's kind of cool stuff. There's machine learning, voice processing, gaming applications, and more. And then also you can get massive scale. And you could have that with any cloud provider, but I think if you learn AWS at a detailed level, some of it got cut off here. On the left is AWS, middle is Azure, and the right is Google Cloud. So if you're really familiar with AWS or Google Cloud, you can transfer that knowledge to other cloud environments. So you're able to kind of more quickly get up to speed in those. I have kind of a story where I had done a lot of Ruby on Rails stuff, and then I was put on a Node project, and I had to come up to speed really quickly. But just knowing certain things about the Ruby environment, I was able to kind of more quickly transfer that knowledge. Say, okay, there's a package over here in Ruby land. I wonder if there's a similar package in Node land, and there is. So so I think if you kind of have some experience in one domain, you can transfer that to others. So I think people are like, oh, serverless. I don't need to know how anything works, right? I can just run these commands and it works. So I think that is good in theory, but I think once you get beyond a template of architecture, you have to actually kind of understand how it works under the hood, right? So I think what you're actually doing is you're going to be modifying these kind of YAML files that have IAM configuration and various permissions. If you don't understand how that works or what are the right commands, then it's going to take some time to kind of get up to speed. So the more background you can have on this, I think the better. And even maybe you have a template, but it actually is doing these 8 different things. And so then what actually happens under the hood? What happens if something goes wrong? How do I debug that? So I think, getting a sense, this is just kind of example architecture. You don't have to really understand it, but, understanding what is happening, I think will help you kind of make better decisions and move more quickly. So one last thing here on the why it's important. I think career advancement. These are just kind of some wild numbers I pulled off the internet. They're probably not normalized for Indianapolis market, but just a sense of this is a valuable skill. Employers are willing to pay for it. We have some people looking for jobs today. If you could have somebody who has a AWS certification or AWS knowledge, I think that would be a valuable thing. So I've kind of given you the carrot of why it's important. Now, why is it hard? So I think it's both wide and deep. So I think wide, it covers a lot of different, skills and backgrounds. So there's everything from software development to DevOps to sysadmin. You have to think about security, cost management, reliability. It's also deep. So, for any given service, there are hundreds of configuration parameters that you might have to modify and know. Hopefully there's documentation on that in line, but maybe there's not, and you have to kind of look it up. There's detailed permissions models. So, like, how do I know if this service can talk to this other service? Even maybe if you're at a certain level, like, you have to know the low-level networking details. Like, okay, what are the IP configurations between these two machines or something? So there's definitely a lot to know. So I think you'll get to this AWS page, and kind of this is the AWS services homepage. So you kind of look at this and say, okay, not too bad. It's like a standard landing page. I got like the Death Star over here. I click on services or products, and all of a sudden I see like hundreds and hundreds of different products, right? And this page goes down for like another half a page that is like off the screen. So I think it's very intimidating. You get here at the beginning, and it's like, oh wow, there's just like a ton to know. So I think most people, when they see this, they have this reaction, right? They're just like, all right, I'm done, like quit. So I think don't have that reaction. It gets better as you kind of get more familiar with it. So one aspect of this, I showed you all those different services. And then there's kind of a pace of innovation with AWS where it's exponentially growing. So in 2016, there were 1,017 new services or features added, and that was just like in that year, in those 2 years, and that's just new services. So it's not just like the existing ones. So there's kind of a ramp up. So you kind of have to keep up with the changing pace of technology. So kind of minor digression, the way that AWS is able to sustain that is they have like very small teams that are focused on like one mission. So maybe a team that just works on S3, this one aspect of it. So what that allows Amazon to be able to do is to move quickly and to like kind of get a lot of things out there. But one of the ramifications of that and why it makes it hard is that not all the APIs are standardized, or like they're not all the same across all the different teams. So it becomes potentially like the capitalization of this one is going to be different than another one. The benefit to you is that you get services more quickly, but potentially there is not much standardization sometimes. So I think they're probably working on addressing that or improving that, but that's a consideration. Another thing is that if AWS launches a new service, they may have to support that for many years to come. So there might be things that they don't even advertise anymore that are still out there that you might have to be aware of or just kind of knowledgeable of. I think another reason why learning AWS is hard is there's more than one way to do it. So if you have a database, like you say, okay, I want to make a database, right? That's a thing that is pretty easy. So there's hundreds or tens of different ways that you can do this. Do I use DynamoDB? Do I use Elasticache? Like, what are these things? I have to learn all these maybe to make an informed decision. And there's actually, like I said before, there's maybe other databases that they don't really support or advertise, but that are still available. So you might be reading an old blog post and you're like, oh, I should check out this service, but it's not even really around, or it's not really heavily advertised. One thing that I've kind of struggled with is like tying things together. So it's like, okay, I have S3 and I know how that works. Now, how do I like get other services to use it? Or how do I get like these 5 different things to talk to each other, So I think it's kind of like, how do I get a sense of how is my application running as a whole? I think that can be kind of a challenge. And then I think one last thing I'd like to say is just there's no clear done point. So if you're in a course or a class of some sort, when the semester's over, you're done, right? You've learned all there is to know about whatever that subject is. At least that's the official story, right? But I think with AWS, there's just kind of a, you can go deep and wide on a lot of different categories. Like some people spend their whole careers just doing, these things. So I think that to me is a challenge because it's like, okay, as someone who has a limited amount of time, how do I kind of get what I need to get out of this? So it's valuable and it's difficult. So what can we do? So my first suggestion would be just get crystal clear, like where are you coming from and then where are you trying to go? So I think, knowing yourself and your strengths and weaknesses and your experiences will help a lot. Knowing, okay, I come from a software background, so I'll be good at scripting and other kind of things like that, automation maybe, but I'm going to really struggle with, okay, how do these like low-level, networking and, hardware kind of aspects, relate? So I think just getting a sense of that, and I think also like, where are you trying to go? Like, what are your goals with this? I think, you could spend all of your time, studying this, but is that what you want to do? Like, what are you trying to get out of it? So I think those kind of help you get unstuck. So if you're a few months into your learning process, you might say, okay, I'm not feeling super energized by this, and why is that? It's like, am I still driving toward that goal of whatever I set out to do? So the next suggestion is kind of getting your bearings. So I think, had you started learning AWS back in like 2008 or something like that, it might have been a little bit harder to find some documentation. But now there's a lot of resources out there as far as like ebooks or courses. Just even like Amazon's documentation has improved a lot. So easier to learn, I think, the basics than ever before. If you're going to do EC2 or S3 or other kind of like services that have been around for almost a decade now, and those aren't really going to change. So kind of my first suggestion is look through that long list of services and just kind of like dig into a few and read their descriptions at a high level. Just go an inch deep and a mile wide. And then a lot of those things will be like, okay, this is like a VR platform for whatever. And you're like, okay, I don't really need to know that, but it's good to know that it's there. And even this process can take a few hours. One thing I really like is there's a site called AWS in Plain English, and they'll go through, here's what this service is called. It's called EC2, but really it should be called Amazon's virtual servers. And so it's just kind of a nice way of like, if you have some computing experience, like to understand, okay, here's an analogy of what this service is in the cloud. So the next thing is create an AWS account, so you can just kind of play around with the services. You'll need this if you're going to do any sort of actual exploration. There's a free tier for new accounts, so you'll get a bunch of stuff free for about a year, and then even some stuff is free after that. So if you really actually want to learn AWS, you have to do this, in my opinion. And I think one of the things is break your own stuff, not your employer's production account. Like learn here, it's safe. You can set up sandboxes, do all these kind of things, and then when you're ready, you can kind of go to production. Coming from a software engineering background, like some certifications I feel like kind of get a bad reputation or didn't really, it wasn't really a positive necessarily. It was just kind of some signal, but not super positive. But I feel like getting an AWS certification is actually a useful guide for your learning. They're career useful. I think people value them. I think they're somewhat hard, so they're actually like takes a lot of prep and practice. They involve solving real-world problems, so you'll actually get like a story problem that's like, all right, imagine you're on site at a customer, and here's X and Y and Z, and what do you recommend to your customer to do? Is it A, B, C, or D? And it's like, okay, wow, I have to really understand many different aspects of AWS to actually be able to understand this. And that's just for like the associate exams that I looked at. There's a bunch of different paths, and we'll kind of cover those in a minute. The thing I like the most about it is that even if you're not interested in taking it to actually get a certification, I think it can be a useful guide for your learning to say okay, here are the 10 services that I really need to be familiar with in order to be able to say that I know AWS to some degree. So I think because there's a lot of courses and things that are targeted toward pass your associate exam, I think that puts you in a good shape if you want to just take one of those. Cons of getting a certification is it costs money. And also they need to be renewed every 2 years. I didn't realize that when I first was going through it, and so I was like, oh yeah, I'll just get it all of them, but then you kind of have to keep taking those over and over again. So it kind of depends on what do you actually want to invest in that in terms of that, is getting the knowledge enough, or do you want to actually have the certification? So it kind of depends on your goals. You also need to go into a training facility to take those, so it might be a factor. Quickly, here's just kind of a tree. I actually haven't seen much about the foundational ones, but the next level up is the associate. So these are kind of the certifications that you kind of want to start with. Maybe you want to start with the Certified Solutions Architect and then go up to the Certified Solutions Architect Professional. So there's kind of different tiers, and some of those are easier. The ones closer to the bottom are easier, and the ones closer to the top are harder. And then there's some kind of specialty ones on the right there if you want to be an expert at big data or well known for your advanced networking specialties. So then while you're looking at a given certification, they have on their website, here's what this exam will cover and what percentage of things there are. And so if you want to learn how to design highly available, cost-efficient, fault-tolerant, scalable systems, maybe you should check out this certification or study for it, essentially, or find a course around it. So go through some resources that you can do to learn AWS better. So my number one recommendation is to find a paid video course. This is really helpful because a lot of the things that you're going to do in AWS are kind of visual, or you have to kind of see somebody clicking through, so you'll actually get to see somebody walking you through, here's how you configure this thing, here's how you set up this particular setting. And it's targeted tightly at certification, so if you want to go down the certification route, it's definitely recommended. Also, it's just it's a good here's all the things that are kind of basics of AWS that you should learn. So I personally used A Cloud Guru for the associate exam preparation, and then I think Cloud Academy was a sponsor of IndyAWS at some point, so I wanted to make sure that they're on there, and I think there are others as well. They're hours of material, can rewatch at your own pace. They're usually like probably under $100 for most of them, and sometimes less than that if you find a good deal. One thing I really like is that there are progress bars, so you can kind of see like, okay, I'm 30% of the way through this material, and so I think that's a good motivator for like, okay, maybe tonight I'll just kind of knock out a couple hours of this, watching these videos, and that'll be like helpful. And then what I really like is they'll have you set up like a highly available WordPress cluster, that, okay, if any node goes down, it'll self-heal itself. And it's like, okay, cool, I can just practice that, and then when I'm done, they'll even tell me how to like spin these things down so I don't get charged for them. So I think overall it's like a good way of learning and kind of balancing learning with doing as well, which is one thing I like about it. Next, along kind of similar lines, like checking out YouTube videos. So there's a little bit less structure than the video courses, but if you want to understand like a specific concept in more detail, it can be really helpful. You can actually find some really good series and playlists, though. Like AWS's user account is awesome. They have all like the AWS Summit, reInvent videos up there. So if you want to dive into that, it's like very valuable. So there's also podcasts. So AWS puts out an official podcast and a This Week podcast. They update weekly. Usually I think it's good for knowing like here's what's coming up or here's what's new, but maybe not. If you don't have any context, it might just be kind of like, we just updated the FizzBuzz service to do this thing. And you're like, well, I have no idea what that is or like what it's doing. So might be something to check out later on. Also, kind of go back to the YouTube one. With the reInvent podcast, they actually have all those talks in podcast format, so you can subscribe, so you can listen in your car. One kind of challenge is that they'll be like talking and saying, "Okay, I love this slide. It's got a great graph," and like the crowd will go wild, and you're like, "Okay, I can't see that. Like I'm in my car, like listening to this." But for the most part, it works out pretty well, and you can even speed those up if it helps. I find it helpful for like understanding how do people actually use AWS in the wild. Like they'll say, okay, here's the challenge that we face, and like here's the architecture that we came up with. So I think it's kind of like that's that kind of putting all the pieces together. I find is really valuable. One aspect you might consider that is underrated is getting social. So you're all out here at this meetup. That's great. You can meet like-minded people. There's also the IndyAWS and IndyAWS Meetups, which they cover a lot of serverless kind of stuff there. There's probably others. Maybe if people have other meetups, we can talk about that at the end. There's a Slack group called the Indie Hackers Slack group, and there's probably others that have like DevOps-specific channels. And I know there's reInvent and Summit, and there's probably others as well in the Midwest. So check those out. There's kind of this is a disclaimer. I've not done any of the official trainings, but it seems like, I wouldn't recommend them necessarily unless you have like a lot of money and a short deadline. It's kind of like you go in there and for like 5 days of intensive training, it's like, I don't know if you get as much as if you do kind of like your own self-study on your time, but on the other hand, it's like if you, want to really learn it quickly, maybe that's the way to go. So I guess I can't really say it one way or the other, but something to keep in mind. Toward the end here are the resources. There's called AWS white papers, and so that's just like a 60-page PDF on the business value of AWS. And so if you really want to deep dive into some aspects of AWS, there's just a bunch of different categories and a bunch of papers, and those are regularly updated. And typically, if you're studying for like a certification, the person will say, okay, you should really read these 10 white papers and understand them in detail because the certification will cover those topics. So. One last thing here is, you can find different tutorials or architecture diagrams online. Again, this is kind of good for understanding like how does a real-world application work, and how do people think about these problems. It's like, okay, I had this problem, I set up these 8 services, and then I ran into this error, and then this is how I solved it. Like to me, that's really actionable because I think those are the kind of things that you'll run into as well. So some of these might be exactly what you're looking for, but others, maybe this is a thing that was 5 years ago, and there's a new service that actually takes care of a lot of this kind of stuff. So you just kind of need to take it with the appropriate grain of salt. So we've covered different resources. Now, how do you actually like implement these things? So if I could told you, how would you like to have 200 hours to learn AWS? You'd be like, all right, sign me up. Like, I have 200 free hours would be great. So I think the way to do that is to kind of say, okay, every week I'm going to make a plan and I'm going to spend 4 hours. And if I spend 4 hours a week for, a whole year, that's 200 hours, right? So you got to kind of carve that time out, make that time. I think it's like, again, what do you want to learn and what's your timeline? And then what I typically do, so this is kind of like an adult learning situation. You're not in like a course or a class of some sort. You kind of have to set up your own goals and your own like timeline. So kind of thinking through, okay, like what do I want to learn, and then doing weekly check-ins is what I typically do. So I create a calendar reminder every Sunday. I'm going to go through and say, okay, what did I do last week, and then what do I want to do this coming week? So maybe my goal was, okay, I wanted to spend 4 hours studying AWS, and I actually did 6 hours. Awesome. So then, you can kind of go back and say, okay, cool, I can update my plan or update, where I'm at, what I want to learn next. Then as you kind of get to understand it better, you might say, okay, my next thing is I want to make a project that uses these two services together in some way. Like maybe you want to make like a podcast app or something like that. So you just do that really, over the course of a week or 2 weeks. And then sometimes, you'll get stuck. You say, well, actually, I spent an hour last week because I got bogged down by some work stuff or something like that. So it's kind of like, how do you adjust that plan going forward so that you're kind of, on target to hit what you want to hit? And then usually I just kind of have some sort of accountability, like, maybe you're talking to your significant other or your boss or, somebody who is outside of that, just to kind of say like, hey, you were studying that AWS thing. How's that kind of coming along? So I think it's good to have that sort of accountability. Some people even will publish notes like on a weekly basis to kind of say, okay, here's what I've been learning the last week. I think that can be good for your own notes and also for that accountability aspect. So cool, we did it. I feel like I covered all the things. I don't know where I'm at on time. Just a quick summary. So I think, kind of figure out why do you want to learn AWS. I think getting oriented, signing up for a new account will help you kind of actually explore it. I think buying a good video course is a good ROI, good investment. I think going through that on a weekly basis or something is good. And then, kind of creating a weekly plan and keeping yourself accountable. Those would be my highest level recommendations. And then kind of last thing is, I think, again, you want to balance that learning with the doing. If you're always just reading posts and stuff, but you're never actually trying it, like you're not going to internalize it and you're not going to know how to get past those errors when you get to them. So. Yeah, they'll recommend you kind of do some other supplementary kind of things. So they'll say make sure you've read these 10 or 15 white papers and and then you understand that, and even here's some practice exams. So that's one aspect I liked about it as well, was okay, practice exams. So full disclosure, I haven't actually taken any of these exams. I'm still at that okay, still learning it, but overall, I think it was very helpful for me, and kind of you hear it, you see it, you get to practice it. I think it's learning in a lot of different ways, so I think it's really helpful. Yeah, I think that's definitely a challenge. How do you keep up with the new updates? I think for me, it's like I said, I think the basics aren't going to change as much as the kind of the more fringe services. So I think it's if you're learning the core AWS concepts and what is a VPC, right? That's going to be around for a while, I think. So I think it's kind of getting, and I think taking those certifications as here are the core concepts. I think that helps a lot. And then there was always going to be changes, and depending on what your kind of goals are around that, you should kind of adjust accordingly. I think going to these kind of meetups or going to the reInvent or something, you'll definitely see a lot of those kind of major changes as well. So. Nope. I've done CI in general, maybe not with AWS specifically. I know there's some services around that. They have kind of almost like a developer tier of services that are kind of oriented around committing your code and doing CI on that and things, almost like Heroku pipelines or something like that in a way. So, yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah. All right, let's give Anthony a big round of applause.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.